The porcelain cup shattered against the marble floor before Eleanor Hartfield even understood what she had said wrong. Duke Alastair Ashford stood over her, his face pale with fury, his hands trembling at his sides. The grand library of Ashford Hall, usually a place of quiet comfort for Eleanor, now felt like a courtroom, and she was the one on trial. "Are you crazy?" the Duke said again, his voice lower this time but sharper, like a blade drawn slowly across silk. "You expect me to place my family's name, my family's fortune, into a venture led by a woman with no title, no lineage, and no right to sit at that table." Eleanor did not flinch, though every part of her wanted to. She had rehearsed this moment for weeks. She had imagined it going differently. She had imagined Alastair listening, at least for a moment, before making his decision. She had not imagined this. "I am not asking you to hand me anything, Your Grace," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the storm rising in her chest. "I am asking you to invest in an idea that could double the estate's trade income within 2 years. I have the numbers. I have contacts in the shipping guild who are willing to work with us. I only need your name attached to open the doors that are currently closed to me." "My name," Alastair repeated, as though the words themselves offended him. "You want my name." "For the venture," Eleanor clarified quickly, "not for anything else." But it was too late. The damage of the phrase hung in the air between them, and Alastair's eyes narrowed with something that looked dangerously close to suspicion, or perhaps disdain, or perhaps both. "Do you know what people will say?" he asked. "Do you understand what it means for a duke to align his name with a merchant's daughter chasing profit like a common tradesman? I did not build this family's reputation over 3 generations to have it dragged through the mud by a woman with ambitions above her station." The words landed like physical blows, each one striking somewhere Eleanor had not known was so tender. She had grown up watching her father struggle to keep their small trading business afloat, watching him work 16-hour days only to be dismissed by men exactly like the one standing before her now. She had told herself she was different, that she had earned her place at Ashford Hall through years of loyal service as a translator and correspondence manager for the estate. She had told herself that intelligence and hard work meant something, even to men born into titles they had done nothing to earn. She had told herself many things, it seemed, that were simply not true. "I see," she said quietly, gathering the papers she had spent 3 weeks preparing. Her hands did not shake, though she wanted them to, if only to have some physical proof of what this rejection was doing to her inside. "Forgive me for wasting your time, Your Grace." She turned to leave, and that was when she heard footsteps in the hallway just beyond the library door, footsteps that stopped abruptly, as though someone had been standing there listening far longer than they should have. Eleanor did not think much of it in that moment. She was too consumed by the humiliation burning through her chest, too focused on holding her composure until she reached the safety of her own small room in the servants' wing of the estate. She walked past the tall windows overlooking the gardens, past the portraits of Ashford ancestors who seemed to stare down at her with the same judgment their descendant had just delivered, and she did not stop until she reached her door and closed it firmly behind her. Only then did she allow herself to sit on the edge of her narrow bed and let the tears come. It was not simply that Alastair had rejected her proposal. Rejection she could have handled. She had faced rejection before, from suppliers who did not trust a woman's signature on a contract, from bankers who assumed she was fetching papers for her father rather than negotiating terms herself. What cut deeper was the way he had said it, the disbelief in his voice, as though the very idea that she might have something valuable to offer was laughable on its face. "Are you crazy?" The words repeated themselves in her mind, long after the sound of them had faded from the room. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, running through every argument she should have made, every point she should have pressed harder, every moment she could have defended herself more forcefully instead of simply gathering her papers and walking away. By the time dawn broke through her small window, she had convinced herself that her time at Ashford Hall was likely coming to an end. A duke did not forget an insult, even one delivered by his own hand. She rose, dressed in her usual gray working dress, and made her way to the small office where she handled the estate's foreign correspondence. The work was familiar, almost soothing in its repetition, and for a few hours she managed to lose herself in translating letters from a French wine merchant interested in trade terms with the estate's vineyards. It was nearly noon when a soft knock came at her door. She looked up, expecting one of the housemaids, and instead found herself looking at Lord Julian Ashford, the Duke's younger brother, standing in the doorway with an expression she could not quite read. Elinor had spoken to Julian perhaps a dozen times in the 2 years she had worked at Ashford Hall. He was quieter than his brother, more reserved, often found in the estate's small library reading rather than attending the social gatherings his brother seemed to relish. He managed the estate's agricultural accounts with a careful, methodical precision that Elinor had always privately admired, though they had never worked closely together. "Lord Julian," she said, rising from her desk out of habit and respect, "is there something you need?" He hesitated, and for a moment Elinor thought perhaps he had come to deliver some official word about her position at the estate, perhaps even her dismissal. Her stomach tightened at the thought. "I owe you an apology," Julian said instead, closing the door softly behind him. "Not for anything I did myself, but for what my brother said to you yesterday. I was in the hallway. I heard more than I should have." Elinor felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something else entirely, she could not say. "There is no need to apologize on his behalf, my lord. Your brother is entitled to his opinions about how the estate's resources are used." "That is a very diplomatic way of saying he was cruel," Julian said, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth, though his eyes remained serious. "I have known Alastair my entire life. He inherited our father's temper along with his title. He does not always think before he speaks, especially when he feels his authority is being questioned." Elinor said nothing, uncertain how to respond to such candid criticism of a duke from his own brother. "I also heard your proposal," Julian continued, "or at least enough of it to understand the shape of what you were suggesting. A trade venture with the shipping guild, expanded contracts, doubled revenue within 2 years. Is that a fair summary?" Elinor blinked, surprised. "It is, my lord." "Do you have the papers still, the ones you prepared?" She hesitated, wondering what possible reason the Duke's brother might have for asking, wondering if this was some elaborate way of humiliating her further, testing whether she would make the same mistake twice. But there was something in Julian's expression, an earnestness that did not match the cruelty she had encountered the day before, and against her better judgment, she found herself reaching for the folder still sitting on the corner of her desk. "Here," she said, handing it to him, "though I doubt it matters now." Julian took the folder and opened it carefully, his eyes moving across the pages with a focus that reminded Elinor of the way she herself read important documents, slowly, thoroughly, searching for both strengths and weaknesses. "These numbers," he said after a long moment, "where did you get your projections for the shipping guild's current rates?" "I corresponded directly with 2 guild representatives in the port city," Elinor said, some of her earlier confidence returning now that someone was actually engaging with her work rather than dismissing it outright. "I also reviewed the estate's historical trade records going back 15 years to establish a baseline for comparison." Julian nodded slowly, still reading. "This is thorough work, Miss Hartfield, more thorough than most proposals that cross my desk, and I review a great many of them." "Your brother did not share that assessment," Elinor said before she could stop herself, and immediately regretted the bitterness that had crept into her voice. Julian looked up at her, and for a moment something almost sympathetic passed across his features. "My brother assessed the messenger, not the message. It is a common failing among men who have never had to prove their worth to anyone." Elinor did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all. "I would like to review this further if you would permit it," Julian said, closing the folder gently. "Not to undermine my brother's decision, you understand. That is not my intention. But I manage a portion of the estate's agricultural trade independently. And if your projections hold merit, there may be a smaller version of this venture I could pursue on my own authority, without requiring my brother's involvement at all." Alina stared at him, trying to determine whether this was genuine or some kind of elaborate courtesy that would ultimately lead nowhere. She had learned, through years of disappointment, not to trust kindness too quickly, especially from men of standing who had little to lose by offering it. "Why would you do this, my lord? You have nothing to gain from taking on a venture your brother has already dismissed." Julian considered the question seriously, as though it deserved more than a casual answer. "Because I believe good ideas should not die simply because the person who delivers them lacks a title. And because, if I am honest, I have grown tired of watching my brother make decisions based on pride rather than reason. Perhaps this is my small way of disagreeing with him without starting a war neither of us wants." There was something in the way he said it, quiet but resolute, that made Alina believe him, at least enough to allow a small measure of hope back into her chest. A feeling she had been certain she would not experience again after yesterday's humiliation. "Very well, my lord," she said. "The proposal is yours to review. I only ask that you consider it carefully before committing to anything. I would not want you to face your brother's anger on my account." "I have faced my brother's anger many times before, Miss Hartfield," Julian said, a wry note entering his voice. "I find I survive it more easily than most people expect." He left her office a few minutes later, the folder tucked carefully under his arm, and Alina sat back down at her desk, staring at the space where he had been standing, uncertain what exactly had just happened, but aware, somewhere beneath her lingering hurt over the Duke's rejection, of a small and unfamiliar spark of possibility. Word of the Duke's dismissal of Alina's proposal had not stayed contained within the library walls. By the following evening, the estate's servants were speaking of it in hushed tones over their evening meal, and by the end of the week, whispers had reached beyond Ashford Hall entirely, carried by visiting merchants and traveling correspondents who found the story of a translator's bold proposal, and the Duke's furious rejection far too entertaining to keep to themselves. Alina tried her best to ignore the whispers, to focus on her work and maintain her composure whenever she crossed paths with other members of the household staff. But it was difficult, knowing that her private humiliation had become public entertainment for people who had never once bothered to learn her name before this incident, and now seemed endlessly fascinated by the details of her failure. She began taking her meals alone in her room rather than in the servants' hall, avoiding the curious glances and half-whispered conversations that fell silent whenever she entered a room. She told herself it was practical, that she needed the quiet to focus on her remaining duties, but in truth, she simply could not bear the weight of so many eyes upon her, each one carrying some version of the same question. Had she truly believed a duke would take her seriously? It was during this period of quiet retreat that she found herself, almost without meaning to, looking forward to the moments when Julian would appear at her office door, folder in hand, with new questions about her proposal or fresh figures he had calculated on his own. Their conversations were never long, always focused strictly on the business at hand, but there was something steadying about them, something that reminded Alina that not everyone in this grand house viewed her ambition as a flaw to be corrected. She did not yet understand what this growing familiarity meant, or where it might lead. She knew only that for the first time since arriving at Ashford Hall, she felt as though someone within these walls saw her clearly, not as a translator who had overstepped her place, but as a woman whose mind held genuine value. That understanding would grow, slowly and carefully, over the weeks that followed, though neither Alina nor Julian could have predicted, in those early conversations over trade figures and shipping contracts, just how far that growing understanding would eventually carry them both. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, addressed not to Alina but to Julian, though it was Alina who first noticed the seal of the Harrington Shipping Guild pressed into the wax. She recognized it instantly, having corresponded with the guild's representatives for weeks while preparing her original proposal. Julian read it twice before speaking, his expression unreadable in a way that made Alina's chest tighten with anticipation. "They have agreed," he said finally, looking up at her across the small office. "Not to the full venture you originally proposed to my brother, but to a smaller trial arrangement. 6 months. If the numbers hold, they are prepared to discuss the larger contract afterward." Alina felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for weeks. 6 months, she repeated, hardly daring to believe it. "That is enough time to prove the projections were sound." "It is," Julian agreed, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something like genuine excitement in his usually composed features. "I will need to manage this carefully. My brother cannot know the scale of what we are attempting until we have results to show him. If he learns of it too soon, he may forbid it simply out of principle." Alina understood his caution, though a small part of her wondered how long such secrecy could realistically be maintained within a household as observant as Ashford Hall's staff had proven themselves to be. Still, she said nothing of her doubts, choosing instead to focus on the work ahead of them. Over the following weeks, their partnership deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated when Julian first appeared at her office door with an apology on his brother's behalf. What had begun as occasional consultations over trade figures became regular meetings, sometimes lasting well into the evening, as they refined shipping schedules, negotiated terms with the guild's representatives, and worked through the countless small details required to bring a venture of this size into reality. Alina found herself looking forward to these meetings with an eagerness that surprised her. Julian possessed a mind that matched her own in its attention to detail, but where she tended toward caution, always searching for the risk hidden within an opportunity, Julian brought a steadier optimism, a willingness to trust the numbers once they had been thoroughly tested. Together, she began to realize, they made a formidable team, each compensating for the other's blind spots in ways that felt almost effortless. It was during one such evening meeting, as autumn rain fell steadily against the windows of the estate's smaller library, that Alina first noticed something shifting between them that had little to do with shipping contracts or trade projections. "You should rest," Julian said, glancing up from the ledger they had been reviewing together to find Alina rubbing her tired eyes. "It is late, and these figures will still be here in the morning." "I am nearly finished," Alina protested, though even she could hear the exhaustion in her own voice. Julian closed the ledger gently, setting it aside despite her objection. "Miss Hartfield, may I ask you something that has nothing to do with shipping contracts?" Alina looked up, caught off guard by the sudden shift in his tone. "Of course, my lord." "Why does this matter so much to you? The venture, I mean. I understand the financial benefits, certainly, but I sense there is something more driving you than simple profit." Alina considered the question carefully before answering, aware that her response would reveal more of herself than she typically allowed in conversations at Ashford Hall. "My father spent his entire life building a small trading business from nothing," she said finally. "He worked harder than any man I have ever known, and yet he was constantly dismissed by people who saw only his lack of title, never his knowledge or his effort. I watched him swallow that dismissal again and again, and I promised myself I would find a way to prove that ability matters more than birth, even if it took me my whole life to do it." Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite name. "That is a heavy promise to carry." "It is," Alina admitted, "but it is mine to carry, and I intend to see it through." "I believe you will," Julian said simply, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice settled deep in Alina's chest, warmer and more affecting than she was prepared for. Their conversations, from that evening forward, began to wander occasionally beyond the strict boundaries of business. Julian spoke of his childhood, of growing up in his older brother's shadow, always the second son, always expected to defer, to support, to remain quietly useful without ever stepping fully into the light. Alina spoke of her mother's early death, of the years she had spent keeping her father's small household running while also learning the languages and figures that would eventually bring her to Ashford Hall's employ. Neither of them spoke of what was growing between them, not directly, though both were aware of it in the way their meetings had begun to stretch longer than necessary. In the way Julian found reasons to visit her office even on days when no urgent business required his presence. In the way Alina found herself dressing with slightly more care on the mornings she expected to see him. It could not remain hidden forever, of course. Ashford Hall was a house full of watchful eyes, and servants who noticed everything, no matter how carefully their employers believed themselves to be discreet. The first person to notice was Margaret, the head housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman who had served the Ashford family for over 20 years and possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something within her household had shifted. "You are spending a great deal of time with Lord Julian," Margaret observed one afternoon, finding Alina in the linen room searching for extra candles to bring to that evening's meeting. Alina felt her cheeks warm despite her best efforts to remain composed. "We are working on a trade venture together, Margaret." "Nothing more." Margaret's expression suggested she believed only half of that statement, but she said nothing further, simply handing Alina the candles with a knowing look that made Alina's stomach twist with something between embarrassment and fear. If Margaret had noticed, others surely would as well, and Alina understood well enough how quickly rumors traveled within these walls. She thought of the whispers that had followed her after the Duke's public rejection of her proposal, how quickly her private humiliation had become common gossip, and she felt a fresh wave of anxiety at the thought of what might happen if word reached Alistair that his brother had been spending so much private time with the very woman he had so thoroughly dismissed weeks earlier. She raised the concern with Julian that evening, choosing her words carefully as they reviewed the latest shipping reports together. "Margaret noticed today," she said, watching his reaction closely, "that we have been spending considerable time together. I worry what might happen if word reaches your brother, particularly regarding the venture we have not yet told him about." Julian set down his pen, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "I have been thinking about this as well. The trial period concludes in 3 weeks. I believe it is time we brought the results to Alistair directly, before he hears of it second-hand and assumes the worst." Alina felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach at the thought of standing before the Duke again, of facing his judgment a second time. And if he refuses to acknowledge the results, if he simply dismisses the venture regardless of its success, out of pride alone, then he will have to explain that decision to the guild representatives who have already expressed interest in expanding the contract, Julian said, a hint of steel entering his usually gentle voice. "Alistair values the estate's reputation above almost everything else. He will not risk damaging our standing with the guild simply to prove a point against you." Alina wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that logic and results would ultimately override the Duke's wounded pride. But 3 weeks felt like both an eternity and no time at all. And as the date of their planned confrontation approached, she found herself lying awake more often than not, running through every possible outcome, every possible way the meeting with Alistair might unfold. She did not yet know that the greatest challenge awaiting her was not the venture's success or failure at all, but rather the moment, still weeks away, when Julian would take her hand across a stack of shipping ledgers and ask her a question that had nothing to do with trade at all, a question that would change the entire course of her life, and force both of them to confront exactly what they had built together in those quiet evening meetings, far removed from the Duke's disapproving eyes. The trial period's final report arrived on a cold morning in early winter, delivered by a guild messenger who had ridden through the night to ensure Julian received it as quickly as possible. Alina was in her office when Julian burst through the door, an uncharacteristic breathlessness in his voice as he held the letter aloft. "Alina," he said, using her given name for what she realized was the very first time, "the numbers exceed even our most optimistic projections. Revenue is up nearly 40% over the trial period, with 2 additional trade routes already expressing interest in joining the arrangement." Alina rose from her desk so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. 40%, she repeated, hardly daring to trust the figure. "Are you certain?" I have read it 3 times, Julian said, laughing now, an unguarded sound she had rarely heard from him. It is real, Eleanor. Your proposal worked. Everything you told my brother that day in the library, everything he dismissed so carelessly, it was all correct. For a moment, standing in that small office with the winter light streaming through the window and Julian's genuine joy radiating toward her, Eleanor allowed herself to simply feel proud, without qualification, without the shadow of the Duke's rejection hanging over the accomplishment. It was, she realized, the first time in months she had felt entirely certain of her own worth, not because someone else had validated it, but because the numbers themselves refused to lie. We should tell him, she said finally, sobering slightly as she considered what came next. Your brother, I mean. Before he hears it from someone else. Julian's expression grew more serious, though the excitement did not entirely leave his eyes. Yes, tomorrow, I think. Give me tonight to prepare the full report properly, with every figure documented beyond dispute. I want to leave him no possible avenue for argument. Eleanor nodded, though anxiety was already beginning to creep back into her chest at the thought of facing Alistair again, of standing in that same library where he had once looked at her with such open disdain. She wondered whether success would be enough to change his opinion of her, or whether some men simply could not be moved by evidence alone, their pride too deeply entrenched to accept that they had been wrong. She would find out soon enough, though the confrontation that awaited them the following day would prove far more complicated and far more consequential than either of them had prepared for. Alistair Ashford stood at the window of his study when Julian and Eleanor entered the following afternoon, his back turned to them, his hands clasped behind him in a posture Eleanor had come to associate with the Duke's most severe moods. She felt her pulse quicken as they crossed the threshold, memories of their last encounter in this house rising unbidden in her mind. Julian, Alistair said without turning, I received a curious letter this morning from a representative of the Harrington Shipping Guild. He congratulated me on the success of a trade venture I had no knowledge of undertaking. Julian stepped forward, the leather folder containing their full report held steady in his hands. Alistair, if you would allow us to explain. Explain, Alistair repeated, finally turning to face them. His eyes moved from his brother to Eleanor, and something hardened in his expression the moment recognition set in. So this is your doing, Miss Hartfield. I dismiss your proposal, and you take it to my brother instead, behind my back, without my knowledge or consent. With respect, Your Grace, Eleanor said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs, Lord Julian approached me. I did not seek him out. Alistair's gaze shifted to his brother. Is this true? It is, Julian said, his voice calm but firm. I heard Miss Hartfield's proposal from the hallway that day, Alistair. I believed it had merit, and I pursued it using my own portion of the estate's agricultural trade authority, which I am entitled to manage independently. I did nothing that exceeded my rights as your brother and partner in this estate. Alistair's jaw tightened, a muscle working visibly beneath the skin. You went behind my back. I made a decision within my own authority, Julian corrected, his tone gaining an edge Eleanor had rarely heard from him before. And that decision has resulted in a 40% increase in trade revenue over a 6-month trial period, with 2 additional shipping routes now expressing interest in expanding the arrangement. Here, he extended the folder toward his brother. Every figure is documented. Every claim can be verified independently through the Guild's own records. Alistair did not immediately reach for the folder. Instead, he stared at Julian for a long, tense moment, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath, uncertain which way this confrontation might turn. You embarrassed me, Alistair said finally, his voice quieter now but no less intense. Do you understand that? You took a proposal I had already rejected, publicly, and pursued it in secret. And now I am expected to simply accept that I was wrong, in front of my own household, in front of the very servants who watched me dismiss this woman's idea only months ago. No one is asking you to make a public admission of error, Julian said. I am asking you to look at the results and decide, as the head of this family, whether it serves our interests to expand the venture further. The pride of the matter can remain a private conversation between us." Alistair finally took the folder, his movements sharp with barely restrained frustration. He flipped through the pages in silence, and Alina watched his expression shift slowly from anger to something more complicated as the numbers before him refused to be argued with. She had seen this transformation before, in bankers and merchants who had initially dismissed her, but eventually found themselves persuaded by evidence too solid to dispute. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that Alistair might prove capable of the same shift. "These numbers are accurate?" he asked finally, not looking up from the pages. "Independently verifiable through the guild's own ledgers," Julian confirmed. Alistair closed the folder slowly, setting it down on the corner of his desk. When he looked up again, his eyes settled on Alina with an expression she could not entirely decipher, somewhere between grudging respect and lingering resentment. "Your projections were correct," he said, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "I will not pretend otherwise, given what is documented here." Alina felt a small measure of relief loosen the tension in her shoulders, though she sensed the conversation was far from finished. "However," Alistair continued, his tone hardening again, "I remain troubled by the manner in which this was pursued. You went around me, Miss Hartfield, both of you did. And I cannot help but wonder what else has been happening within my own household that I have not been made aware of." There was something in the way he said it, a pointed emphasis that made Alina's stomach drop, and she understood immediately that Alistair suspected more than simply a business partnership had developed between his brother and his household translator during those months of secret meetings. Julian's expression remained composed, but Alina saw a slight tightening around his eyes that told her he had understood the implication as well. "I'm not certain what you are suggesting, Alistair," Julian said carefully. "Are you not?" Alistair's gaze moved between them, sharp and assessing. "You have spent countless evenings together over the past 6 months, Julian. Margaret has mentioned it to me more than once, though I confess I did not think much of it until this morning's letter arrived, and I began to understand exactly how much time you two have spent in each other's company." Alina felt heat rush into her cheeks, and she fought the urge to look away from the Duke's penetrating stare, understanding instinctively that any sign of guilt or embarrassment would only confirm whatever suspicions he was forming. "We were working, Your Grace," she said, choosing her words with careful precision. "The venture required extensive planning and correspondence. Late evenings were often necessary given the demands of both our regular duties." "Perhaps," Alistair said, though his tone made clear he was not entirely convinced. He turned his attention fully to his brother now, and something shifted in his posture, a kind of proprietary tension that Alina recognized from stories she had heard about the complicated dynamic between the two brothers, one always in the shadow of the other, one always measuring himself against expectations he had not chosen for himself. "Julian, a word with you alone, if you would permit it," Alistair said, his eyes flicking briefly to Alina. "Miss Hartfield, thank you for your work on this venture. It has proven more valuable than I initially anticipated. You may return to your regular duties now." Alina understood the dismissal for what it was, and though every instinct told her to remain, to stand beside Julian as this conversation unfolded, she recognized that pressing the matter further would only make things more difficult for both of them. She gathered herself, offered a brief nod to both brothers, and left the study, though she did not go far, lingering in the hallway just beyond the door, close enough to hear raised voices without being able to distinguish the exact words being exchanged. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her heart pounding, straining to make sense of the muffled argument taking place behind the heavy oak door. She caught fragments, Alistair's voice rising sharply at one point, something about family reputation and proper conduct, followed by Julian's voice, steadier but no less forceful, defending something Alina could only assume was their growing relationship, though she could not be certain without hearing the words clearly. Finally, the door opened, and Julian emerged, his face flushed but his composure largely intact. He caught sight of Alina waiting in the hallway, and something in his expression softened immediately. "You heard," he said, not quite a question. "Not the words," Alina admitted. "Only that voices were raised." Julian glanced back toward the closed study door, then gestured for Alina to walk with him, leading her away from the study and toward the quieter corridor that led to the estate's east wing. "He suspects there is something between us," Julian said once they were far enough away to speak privately. He did not say it outright, but the implication was clear enough. "What did you tell him?" Alina asked, her voice barely above a whisper despite the empty hallway around them. Julian stopped walking and turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made Alina's breath catch in her chest. "I told him the truth, Alina. That over these past months, working alongside you, I have come to feel things I did not expect to feel. Things that go far beyond respect for your intelligence or admiration for your work." Alina stood very still, uncertain she had heard him correctly, though the earnest intensity in his eyes left little room for doubt. "Julian," she began, though she was not entirely certain what she intended to say next. "I know this is complicated," he continued before she could find her words. "I know my brother's reaction to your original proposal has already caused you considerable pain, and I know that whatever exists between us now will only complicate matters further within this household. But I find I can no longer pretend these feelings do not exist, Alina, not to my brother, and certainly not to myself." Alina's heart was pounding so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it in the quiet corridor. She thought of everything she had told herself over these months, that their meetings were purely professional, that the warmth she felt in his presence was simply the satisfaction of finally being taken seriously by someone of standing. She recognized now, standing before him in this quiet hallway, that she had been lying to herself for quite some time. "I feel it too," she admitted finally, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating as they left her lips. "I have felt it for weeks now, though I told myself it was foolish to hope for anything more than what we had built professionally." Julian's expression transformed, relief and joy mingling openly across his features in a way that made Alina's chest ache with something she had rarely allowed herself to feel. He reached for her hand, his fingers closing gently around hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply standing together in the quiet hallway, allowing the truth of their feelings to settle between them at last. But even as she allowed herself this moment of quiet happiness, Alina could not entirely shake the memory of Alistair's raised voice behind that study door, nor the pointed way he had dismissed her from the room. She understood, with a certainty that tempered her joy, that whatever had passed between the brothers in that study was far from resolved, and that the true test of their feelings for one another was only just beginning. That evening, as Alina sat alone in her small room attempting to process everything that had happened, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find one of the younger housemaids, a nervous girl named Charlotte, holding a folded note. "This was left for you, Miss Hartfield," Charlotte said quickly, before hurrying away down the hall without further explanation. Alina closed the door and unfolded the note with trembling hands, recognizing the elegant, sharp handwriting immediately as belonging to Duke Alistair Ashford himself. "Miss Hartfield," the note read, "I would appreciate the courtesy of your presence in my study tomorrow morning, alone, before you resume your usual duties. There are matters between us that require further discussion, matters that extend beyond the venture we spoke of today." Alina read the note twice, her mind racing through every possible reason the Duke might wish to speak with her privately, none of the possibilities she conjured bringing her any comfort. She folded the note carefully and set it on her small desk, knowing that whatever tomorrow's conversation held, it would likely determine far more than simply the fate of a trade venture. It would determine whether she and Julian had any real future within these walls at all, or whether the Duke's disapproval would prove strong enough to end things before they had truly begun. She did not sleep at all that night, her mind turning over every possible version of the conversation to come, and when dawn finally broke over Ashford Hall, she rose, dressed carefully, and made her way toward the Duke's study with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, determined to face whatever awaited her with the same resolve that had carried her through every rejection and every doubt that had come before. The study looked different in the pale morning light than it had the previous afternoon, softer somehow, though Alastair's posture as he stood behind his desk remained just as rigid as before. He gestured for Alina to sit, and she did, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "I will speak plainly, Miss Hartfield," Alastair began, not bothering with any pretense of casual conversation. "My brother informed me last night that his feelings toward you extend well beyond professional respect. He tells me he intends to pursue a courtship with you, with the eventual goal of marriage." Alina's breath caught, though she kept her expression as neutral as she could manage. She had not expected Julian to have declared his intentions quite so formally, so quickly, though perhaps she should have anticipated it given the seriousness with which he had spoken to her in the hallway the day before. "I was not aware he had spoken to you in such definite terms," Alina said carefully. "He was quite definite," Alastair confirmed, his voice tight. "And I confess, Miss Hartfield, I find myself in a difficult position. On one hand, you have proven yourself capable, intelligent, and more astute in matters of trade than many men who have held positions of authority within this estate for years. I do not say that lightly, nor do I say it to flatter you. The numbers speak for themselves, and I am not a man who ignores evidence simply because it is inconvenient." Alina waited, sensing there was more to come, some qualification that would undercut whatever grudging respect he was extending. "On the other hand," Alastair continued, confirming her suspicion, "you are not of noble birth. You have no title, no family connections that would strengthen this house's standing among our peers. If Julian marries you, he forfeits any possibility of a match that might benefit this family's position within society. Do you understand what I am asking of you, Miss Hartfield?" Alina's spine straightened, old wounds from his earlier rejection rising fresh in her chest, despite her attempts to remain composed. "You are asking me to consider stepping aside, to spare your family the embarrassment of an unequal match." "I am asking you to consider what is truly best for my brother," Alastair corrected, though the distinction felt thin to Alina's ears. "Julian has always lived somewhat in my shadow. He has never had the opportunities I have had, never been given the same consideration by our peers. A marriage to you, however capable you may be, will only compound the ways in which society already views him as the lesser Ashford brother." The words stung more than Alina cared to admit, not because she believed them to be entirely wrong, but because she recognized in them an echo of every doubt she had carried about her own worth since childhood, every quiet fear that no amount of ability could ever fully compensate for the circumstances of one's birth in the eyes of people like Alastair Ashford. "With respect, Your Grace," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, "I believe that decision belongs to Julian, not to you, and certainly not to me acting on your behalf. If he has chosen to pursue a courtship with full knowledge of the social consequences, then it is his choice to make, as a grown man capable of determining his own future." Alastair's expression darkened slightly, though something in his eyes suggested he had perhaps expected this response, even if he had hoped for a different one. "You are asking me to simply accept that my brother will marry beneath his station, that this family's reputation will bear whatever consequences follow." "I am asking you to trust your brother's judgment," Alina said. "You spoke yesterday of the venture's success, of numbers too solid to dispute. I would ask you to apply that same standard of evidence here. Look at who Julian has become over these past months. Look at the work we have accomplished together, and ask yourself honestly whether that partnership has diminished him in any way or strengthened him." For a long moment, Alastair said nothing, his jaw working as though he were chewing over an argument he could not quite formulate. Alina held her ground, refusing to look away, refusing to give him any indication that his words had shaken her resolve, though in truth they had shaken it considerably. "I loved someone once," Alastair said finally, his voice quieter, almost surprising Alina with its sudden vulnerability. Before I inherited the title, a woman of modest means, much like yourself, my father forbade the match, insisted it would damage our family's standing beyond repair. I obeyed him, Miss Hartfield, because I believed duty to this family outweighed my own happiness. I have wondered every year since whether that was the right decision. Elinor felt something shift in her chest at this unexpected admission, a crack of humanity appearing in the rigid, dismissive facade the Duke had presented to her since their very first meeting. "And do you believe it was the right decision?" she asked softly. Alistair was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting toward the window, toward some memory Elinor could not see. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "I have built a successful life, maintained this family's standing, fulfilled every duty expected of me. And yet I find myself, standing here, envying my brother's willingness to risk everything for something he believes in, something I was never brave enough to pursue for myself." Elinor did not know how to respond to such an admission, coming as it did from a man who had shown her nothing but disdain only months earlier. She sat quietly, allowing the silence to stretch between them, sensing that Alistair needed the space to work through whatever conflict was playing out behind his composed exterior. "I will not stand in Julian's way," Alistair said finally, straightening his shoulders as though physically shaking off the vulnerability he had just revealed. "But I want it understood clearly, Miss Hartfield, that this family's reputation matters a great deal to me, and I expect both of you to conduct yourselves in a manner that reflects well upon this house, regardless of whatever obstacles society may place before you." Elinor felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes, though she forced herself to maintain her composure in front of the Duke. "Thank you, Your Grace. I promise you, I have no intention of bringing anything but honor to this family, should Julian and I choose to pursue a future together." Alistair nodded once, a curt gesture that nonetheless carried more warmth than anything he had offered her before. "See that you keep that promise, Miss Hartfield. I have given my consent, however reluctantly. I will not easily give my forgiveness if that consent proves misplaced." Elinor left the study that morning with a lightness in her chest she had not expected, though she understood the Duke's blessing, however genuine it might prove to be, would not be the last obstacle standing between her and the future she was beginning to imagine alongside Julian. Society itself, with all its rigid expectations and quiet cruelties, would prove a far more persistent adversary than even Alistair Ashford's wounded pride. News of Julian's intentions spread through society far more quickly than Elinor had anticipated, and far less kindly than Alistair's grudging acceptance had led her to hope. Within a fortnight, invitations to the estate's usual social gatherings began arriving with noticeably cooler language, and several long-time acquaintances of the Ashford family found sudden reasons to decline visits they would ordinarily have welcomed with enthusiasm. The first true test came at Lady Pembroke's autumn gathering, an event the Ashford family had attended every year for as long as Elinor had worked within their household. Julian insisted she accompany him, arguing that hiding away would only confirm whatever assumptions society had already formed. But Elinor felt every eye in the room upon her the moment she entered on his arm, felt the way conversations dimmed slightly as she passed, only to resume in hushed, pointed tones once she had moved beyond earshot. "Pay them no mind," Julian murmured, his hand steady at the small of her back as they moved through the crowded ballroom. "Their opinions matter far less than you might imagine." "They matter to your reputation," Elinor said quietly, unable to fully mask the anxiety threading through her voice, "and by extension to mine." She was not wrong to worry. Halfway through the evening, as Julian was pulled away briefly to greet an old family friend, Elinor found herself approached by Lady Camilla Ashworth, a woman known throughout society for her sharp tongue and her delight in other people's misfortunes. "Miss Hartfield," Lady Camilla said, her smile thin and calculating, "how very bold of you to attend tonight given the circumstances. I must say I did not expect a household translator to rise quite so high, quite so quickly. One wonders what methods you employed to secure Lord Julian's affections so thoroughly." The implication in her words was unmistakable, and Alina felt heat flood her cheeks, though she forced herself to maintain her composure, refusing to give Lady Camilla the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the insult had landed. "I am not certain what you are suggesting, Lady Camilla," Alina said, her voice steady despite the fury building beneath her calm exterior. "But I can assure you, Lord Julian's affections were earned through months of honest work and genuine partnership, nothing more." "Of course," Lady Camilla said, her smile widening in a way that made clear she believed nothing of the sort. "Though I imagine such honest work has its own particular charms, does it not, when practiced late in the evening behind closed office doors?" Alina's hands clenched at her sides, and it took every ounce of restraint she possessed to keep from responding with the sharp retort forming on her tongue. She was saved from having to formulate a response at all by the sudden appearance of Julian at her side, his expression darkening the moment he caught the tail end of Lady Camilla's insinuation. "Lady Camilla," he said, his voice carrying a chill Alina had never heard from him before, "I would ask you to choose your words more carefully when speaking to my future wife. Miss Hartfield's character is beyond reproach, and I will not tolerate insinuations to the contrary, regardless of who offers them." Lady Camilla's smile faltered slightly at the unexpected firmness of his response, and she offered a shallow, insincere curtsy before retreating into the crowd, though Alina knew well enough that the encounter would only fuel further gossip rather than silence it. "Future wife," Alina repeated once Lady Camilla was out of earshot, her heart suddenly pounding for reasons entirely separate from anger. "You have not yet asked me such a question, Julian." Julian's expression softened immediately, the earlier chill in his eyes melting into something far warmer as he turned to face her fully, seemingly indifferent to the curious glances still being cast their way from across the ballroom. "No," he agreed, "I have not. I confess I had imagined a rather more private moment for that particular conversation, not a crowded ballroom filled with wagging tongues." "Then perhaps we should leave," Alina suggested, a small, hopeful smile beginning to form despite the tension of the evening. They departed Lady Pembroke's gathering earlier than propriety might have strictly allowed, though neither of them cared particularly for propriety's opinion at that moment. Julian guided her out through the garden doors, away from the noise and judgment of the ballroom, into the quiet chill of the autumn evening, where the stars had begun to emerge over the estate's carefully manicured hedges. "I did not intend for tonight to unfold this way," Julian said, taking both her hands in his as they stood together beneath the darkening sky. "I had imagined something more thoughtful, more deliberate, but perhaps some moments are meant to arrive on their own terms, regardless of our careful plans." Alina's heart raced, understanding what was coming, and finding herself utterly unprepared for how completely it would overwhelm her despite months of growing closeness between them. "Alina Hartfield," Julian said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "these past months working alongside you have shown me more about courage, integrity, and genuine partnership than I have learned in all my years before meeting you. I do not care what society whispers, nor what obstacles may yet stand before us. I want to build a life with you, one built on the same honesty and mutual respect that has defined everything we have accomplished together thus far. Will you marry me?" Alina felt tears rise unbidden to her eyes, though they were tears of joy rather than the sorrow she had grown so accustomed to over recent months. She thought of her father, of every dismissal she had endured throughout her life for daring to believe her worth extended beyond her station, and she thought of how thoroughly Julian had proven, through every quiet act of respect and partnership, that such dismissals had never reflected the truth of who she was. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Julian, I will marry you." The joy of that moment carried them both through the following weeks, though it did little to quiet the gossip still circulating through society's drawing rooms, nor did it fully ease the tension that lingered within Ashford Hall itself, where Alastair's blessing remained tinged with visible reluctance despite his promise not to stand in their way. The true crisis came nearly a month after their engagement was formally announced, when a letter arrived at the estate from a distant relation of the Ashford family, a wealthy and influential aunt named Lady Beatrice Ashford, who had long served as something of an arbiter of the family's social standing among the broader aristocracy. The letter was addressed to Alastair, but its contents concerned Elinor directly, and Alastair, to his credit, insisted on reading it aloud to both Julian and Elinor rather than allowing rumor to distort its message further. She threatens to withdraw her support from several of the family's business interests, Alastair said grimly, scanning the letter's contents, if Julian proceeds with this marriage. She believes it will irreparably damage the family's standing among our peers, and she is prepared to use whatever influence she possesses to discourage other families from continuing their associations with us. Elinor felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet, understanding immediately the weight of what Lady Beatrice's opposition might mean, not just for her own future with Julian, but for the entire Ashford family's fortunes. "This is precisely what I feared," Alastair continued, though his tone carried more frustration than triumph, "when I first spoke with you both. Lady Beatrice's influence extends into circles that could affect not only our social standing, but several ongoing business negotiations I have been pursuing for the estate's benefit." Julian's jaw tightened, though his hand found Elinor's beneath the table, a silent reassurance amid the mounting tension. "And what would you have us do, Alastair? Abandon the engagement to appease an aunt who has not visited this estate in over 3 years?" "I did not say that," Alastair replied, though his tone lacked full conviction. "I am simply informing you both of the consequences we may face, so that you enter this marriage with full understanding of what lies ahead." Elinor sat quietly, absorbing the weight of Alastair's warning, understanding that whatever happiness she and Julian had found together now stood at the center of a much larger conflict, one that threatened not just their own future, but the security of an entire family's legacy. She thought of everything she had already sacrificed to reach this point, every rejection endured, every quiet humiliation overcome, and she found herself wondering, for the first time since accepting Julian's proposal, whether her presence in his life might ultimately cost him and his family far more than either of them had been prepared to pay. That night, alone in her room, Elinor began to seriously consider a possibility she had not allowed herself to fully entertain before. That perhaps the noblest choice, the choice that would spare Julian and his family the full weight of society's judgment, was to release him from their engagement entirely, regardless of how deeply it would break her own heart to do so. Elinor did not sleep that night, her mind turning over the same painful calculation again and again, weighing her own happiness against the security of an entire family she had come to genuinely care for over the past year. By dawn, she had made her decision, though the weight of it settled in her chest like a stone she feared she might carry for the rest of her life. She found Julian in the estate's small library shortly after breakfast, exactly where she had known he would be, reviewing correspondence related to their now permanently expanded trade venture. He looked up as she entered, his expression brightening immediately before shifting into concern as he registered the seriousness on her face. "Elinor, what is it?" She closed the door behind her, steadying herself before speaking, aware that once these words left her mouth, there would be no taking them back. "I have been thinking about Lady Beatrice's letter, about everything it could mean for your family's future. I cannot, in good conscience, allow you to sacrifice so much simply to marry me, Julian. Perhaps it would be better for everyone involved if we ended our engagement." Julian set down the letter he had been holding, rising slowly from his chair, his expression unreadable in a way that frightened Elinor more than open anger would have. "You wish to end our engagement." "I wish to spare you the consequences of Lady Beatrice's opposition," Elinor clarified, though even as she spoke the words, she felt how hollow they sounded, how little they matched the true desperation aching in her chest. "Your family's fortune, your standing, everything you and your brother have built, I cannot be the reason it crumbles." Julian crossed the room slowly, stopping directly in front of her, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made it difficult for Elinor to maintain her resolve. "Elinor, look at me. Do you truly wish to end this engagement, or are you simply frightened of the cost, and trying to spare me from a burden I have already chosen to bear willingly?" Elinor felt her carefully constructed resolve begin to crack under the weight of his question, tears rising unbidden to her eyes despite her determination to remain composed. "I do not wish it," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I want nothing more than to marry you, Julian, but I cannot bear the thought of being the reason your family loses everything they have worked for." "Then let that be my burden to carry, not yours," Julian said gently, reaching up to brush a fallen tear from her cheek. "Elinor, I have spent my entire life living carefully, deferring to expectations, never taking the kind of risk that might define a life truly lived. You are the first thing I have ever wanted badly enough to risk everything for, and I will not allow Lady Beatrice, or society's judgment, or even my own family's fortune, to take that from me without a fight." "But what if the fight is not enough?" Elinor asked, her voice small. "What if we lose everything regardless?" "Then we lose it together," Julian said simply, "and we build something new, something entirely our own, free of anyone else's expectations or approval. Elinor, I did not fall in love with a title or a fortune or society's approval. I fell in love with your mind, your courage, your relentless determination to prove your own worth against every obstacle placed in your path. That is not something Lady Beatrice's letter can take from either of us, unless we allow it to." Elinor felt something shift within her chest, the stone of dread that had settled there overnight beginning to lighten under the weight of Julian's unwavering conviction. She realized, standing there in the quiet library, that she had been so consumed by fear of costing Julian something, that she had nearly cost them both the very future they had fought so hard to build together. "I do not want to end our engagement," she said finally, the words emerging with far more certainty than her earlier attempt. "I was afraid, and fear made me foolish. Forgive me, Julian." "There is nothing to forgive," Julian said, pulling her gently into an embrace. "Fear is not foolishness, Elinor. It simply means you understand exactly what is at stake. But I would rather face every obstacle Lady Beatrice and society can throw at us together than build a safe, comfortable life without you by my side." It was Alastair, surprisingly, who ultimately resolved the crisis Lady Beatrice's letter had created, though not before several more weeks of tense negotiation and careful diplomacy that tested every ounce of patience within Ashford Hall. He traveled personally to Lady Beatrice's estate, a journey of nearly 3 days, determined to address his aunt's concerns directly rather than allowing the conflict to fester through further correspondence. Elinor never learned the full details of what passed between the Duke and his aunt during that visit, but Alastair returned nearly a week later with news that softened, though did not entirely dissolve, the tension surrounding their engagement. "She will not actively support the marriage," Alastair reported upon his return, gathering Julian and Elinor together in his study to share the outcome. "But she has agreed to withdraw her threats against our business interests, provided the wedding is conducted with appropriate dignity, and the family's reputation is protected through careful management of the public announcement." "And what did you offer her in exchange for such generosity?" Julian asked, a note of suspicion in his voice that suggested he knew his aunt well enough to doubt her sudden change of heart came without significant persuasion. "I reminded her," Alastair said, a faint, rare smile touching his lips, "of the very venture that Elinor's proposal made possible, the same venture that has now become one of this estate's most profitable arrangements in over a decade. I also reminded her that family loyalty, properly maintained, tends to yield far greater returns than the temporary satisfaction of enforcing outdated social expectations. She is, above all else, a practical woman, whatever her initial objections. Numbers, it seems, prove persuasive to more people than either of you might expect." Elinor felt a rush of gratitude toward the Duke so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her, understanding fully now the depth of what he had risked and sacrificed on her behalf, despite his own earlier reservations about the match. She thought of the man who had once dismissed her so cruelly in this very study, and she marveled at how far he had traveled since that difficult first meeting, how thoroughly he had come to see her not as an unwelcome intrusion into his family's affairs, but as someone deserving of genuine respect and protection. "Thank you, Alistair," she said quietly. "I do not know how I will ever properly repay what you have done for us." "You need not repay anything, Miss Hartfield," Alistair replied, though his use of her formal name had softened considerably since their earlier encounters. "Consider it my apology, long overdue, for the manner in which I first responded to your proposal. I was wrong about you, thoroughly and completely, and I have come to understand that being wrong about someone's worth is a far greater failing than any risk to reputation could ever represent." With Lady Beatrice's opposition neutralized and Alistair's blessing now offered with genuine warmth rather than reluctant tolerance, Elinor and Julian finally found themselves free to plan the wedding they had both begun to fear might never come to pass, though the road ahead, however brighter now, would still demand every ounce of courage and resilience Elinor had spent her entire life cultivating. The wedding took place on a bright morning in early spring, in the small stone chapel that had served the Ashford family for generations, its windows filled with soft light that fell in colored patterns across the modest gathering of guests assembled within. Elinor had chosen to keep the ceremony intimate, resisting the grander affair some among Ashford society had suggested might better suit a match now widely discussed throughout the region, though largely with curiosity rather than the scorn she had once feared. She stood in the small antechamber adjoining the chapel, her hands trembling slightly as Charlotte, the young housemaid who had once delivered Alistair's fateful note, helped fasten the final buttons on her simple ivory gown. Margaret, the head housekeeper whose knowing looks had first alerted Elinor to the danger of discovery so many months earlier, adjusted the delicate veil with practiced hands, her expression softer than Elinor had ever seen it. "You look radiant, Miss Hartfield," Margaret said, though her voice caught slightly on the old title, one that would no longer apply after this morning. "Forgive me. I suppose I ought to grow accustomed to calling you Lady Ashford before the day is through." Elinor smiled, though her own emotions felt too large and complicated to fully articulate. She thought of her father, gone now nearly 6 years, and wished desperately that he could have lived to see this moment, to witness his daughter, born to a modest trading family, standing on the threshold of marriage into one of the region's oldest noble houses, not through deception or manipulation, but through honest work and the slow, steady building of genuine respect. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to find Alistair standing in the doorway, dressed formally for the occasion, his expression carrying none of the coldness she remembered from their first meeting nearly a year earlier. "Julian asked that I check on you," he said, stepping into the room. "Though I suspect he simply wished for an excuse to know you had not changed your mind." "Tell him his fears are entirely unfounded," Elinor replied, a genuine smile breaking through her nervousness. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Alistair nodded, though he hesitated a moment longer, as though there were something else he wished to say. "Miss Hartfield, before we proceed, I wanted to tell you something I have not yet found the proper opportunity to express. Watching you and Julian these past months, watching the partnership you have built together, both in business and in love, I have come to understand something I spent far too many years refusing to accept." "And what is that, Your Grace?" Elinor asked gently. "That character matters far more than circumstance," Alistair said, his voice carrying an unusual sincerity. "That the measure of a person lies not in the family they were born into, but in the integrity with which they meet every challenge placed before them. You have taught me that lesson more thoroughly than any tutor or advisor ever managed throughout my entire life, and I am grateful for it, however painfully the lesson began." Elinor felt tears threatening again, and she reached out to take Alistair's hand, a gesture that would have seemed unthinkable during their first tense encounter in his study so many months before. "Thank you, Alistair." "Truly." "Now," he said, clearing his throat and stepping back with something almost like embarrassment at his own display of sentiment. "Shall we not keep my brother waiting any longer? I believe he has worn a path into the chapel floor with his pacing." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of soft light, quiet vows, and the steady warmth of Julian's hand in hers as they exchanged the promises that would bind their lives together. Elinor would remember, years later, not the specific words spoken by the officiant, nor the precise details of the small gathering assembled to witness their union, but rather the way Julian looked at her throughout the entire ceremony, as though she were the only person present in the chapel, as though every obstacle they had overcome to reach this moment had only deepened his certainty in the choice he was making. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, and Julian leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to her lips, Elinor felt the full weight of everything they had endured together finally settle into something resembling peace. The whispers that had once followed her through Ashford Hall's corridors, the humiliation of Alastair's initial rejection, the anxious months of secret meetings and careful negotiations, Lady Beatrice's threats, and the fear of losing everything before it had truly begun. All of it seemed to fade into distant memory beneath the simple, powerful reality of the promise they had just made to one another. The small reception that followed, held in the estate's largest drawing room, carried none of the cold formality Elinor had feared might mark her introduction to Ashford society as Julian's wife. Instead, she found herself genuinely welcomed by many of the same guests who had once regarded her with such suspicion, their earlier reservations apparently softened by the evident happiness radiating from both Julian and his new bride, and perhaps, Elinor suspected, by the quiet influence Alastair had exercised on her behalf in the months leading up to the wedding. Even Lady Camilla Ashworth, whose sharp insinuations had once cut so deeply at Lady Pembroke's gathering, approached Elinor during the reception with what appeared to be a genuine, if somewhat grudging, attempt at reconciliation. "I confess, Lady Ashford," she said, using Elinor's new title with careful deliberation, "I did not expect this marriage to survive the scrutiny it faced. I find myself pleasantly surprised to be proven wrong." "Circumstances have a way of revealing character, Lady Camilla," Elinor replied, extending the same grace Alastair had shown her that morning, though she could not entirely resist a small note of pointed meaning in her words. "I am glad you have found reason to reconsider your earlier impressions." As the afternoon light began to soften into evening, Elinor found herself standing near the drawing room's tall windows, watching the gathered guests mingle with an ease that would have seemed impossible only months earlier, when Julian approached, offering her a glass of champagne and a warm smile that still, even now, made her heart quicken. "Any regrets, Lady Ashford?" he asked, using her new title with evident delight. "Not one," Elinor said, leaning into him as his arms settled comfortably around her waist. "Though I confess, I never imagined my path to this moment would begin with your brother calling me crazy in his library." Julian laughed, a warm, genuine sound that drew a few curious glances from nearby guests, though neither of them cared in the slightest. "Perhaps we ought to thank him for it, in a strange way. Had he not rejected your proposal so completely, I might never have found the courage to seek you out myself." Elinor considered this, recognizing the strange truth within his observation. Every painful step of her journey, from that first devastating rejection to the whispered gossip of society drawing rooms, from Lady Beatrice's threats to the quiet, steady partnership she had built with Julian over countless evening meetings, had ultimately led her exactly here, to this moment of hard-won happiness she would not trade for anything the world might have offered instead. "Perhaps we shall," she said softly, raising her glass slightly in a private toast to the unlikely, winding path that had brought them together. "Though I do believe, in the end, it was never really about the venture at all, was it?" "No," Julian agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple as the evening light deepened golden across the drawing room. "It never truly was." 5 years passed, and the small trade venture that had once begun as a handful of carefully drafted proposals on Elinor's desk had grown into one of the most respected shipping partnerships in the entire region, its reach extending far beyond the original arrangement with the Harrington Shipping Guild into new routes and new markets that neither Alina nor Julian could have fully imagined during those early evenings of quiet planning in the estate's small library. Alina now managed the venture's operations directly, her title as Lady Ashford opening doors that had once remained firmly closed to a household translator, though she never forgot the years of dismissal and doubt that had preceded this hard-won recognition. She made a point, whenever possible, of extending opportunities to others who might otherwise be overlooked, because of their birth or circumstance, mentoring several young women from modest backgrounds who showed the same sharp intelligence and determination she herself had once carried into Alastair's library with such nervous hope. Julian had grown into his role alongside her with quiet confidence, no longer the overshadowed younger brother he had once described himself as being, but a respected partner in both the venture and the broader management of the Ashford estate, his contributions increasingly recognized by peers who had once dismissed him as merely secondary to his older brother's authority. Alastair, for his part, had remained unmarried, though rumors occasionally circulated regarding renewed correspondence with the woman he had once been forbidden to pursue in his youth. Alina never asked him directly about the matter, respecting the privacy of a wound that had clearly never fully healed, though she noticed, over the years, a gentleness in him that had not been present during their first difficult encounters, a willingness to listen before judging that she liked to believe her own presence in the family had helped cultivate. On a warm afternoon in early summer, Alina sat in the same small library where her journey with Julian had first begun, reviewing correspondence from a new shipping contact in a distant port city, when Julian entered, two small children trailing behind him with the boundless energy particular to youth. Their eldest, a bright-eyed girl named Grace who had inherited her mother's sharp intellect and her father's steady patience, rushed toward Alina's desk with a drawing clutched in her small hands. "Mama, look what I made," Grace announced, presenting a rather ambitious rendering of what appeared to be a ship sailing across improbably large waves. "It is beautiful, darling," Alina said, examining the drawing with genuine admiration. "Perhaps one day you shall help your mother manage real ships across real waves." "Could I truly?" Grace asked, her eyes widening with the particular wonder of a child encountering a new possibility for the first time. "You could do anything you set your mind to," Alina said, kneeling to meet her daughter's eyes directly. "Never let anyone tell you otherwise, no matter how important they believe themselves to be." Julian watched this exchange with quiet warmth, and later that evening, once the children had been settled for the night, he found Alina once more in the small library, standing before the same window where he had first seen her clutching her rejected proposal so many years earlier. "Do you ever think of that day?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "The day my brother called you crazy in his study, and everything that followed from it." "Often," Alina admitted, leaning into his familiar warmth. "I think of how close I came to believing him, to accepting that my worth was truly as small as he made it seem in that moment. I am grateful every single day that you saw something different, something worth pursuing, even when I struggled to see it clearly myself." "I merely recognized what was already there," Julian said softly. "You did the rest yourself, Alina, every step of the way, through every obstacle that stood before us." Alina turned to face him fully, the same steady love she had come to depend on so completely reflected clearly in his eyes, unchanged despite the years that had passed since their first tentative meetings over shipping ledgers and trade projections. "We did it together," she corrected gently, "every step of it. And I would not trade a single difficult moment of that journey, not the rejection, not the whispers, not even your brother's harsh words that first afternoon, because every one of them led us exactly here, to this life, to our children, to everything we have built together." Outside the library window, the estate's garden stretched green and flourishing beneath the fading evening light, the same gardens Alina had once walked through in humiliated silence after Alastair's devastating rejection, now transformed by time and perspective into simply another part of the home she had built for herself. Against every expectation society had once placed upon a woman of her modest origins. The story of the household translator who had dared to propose an ambitious venture to a skeptical duke, only to find genuine partnership and lasting love with his younger brother instead, had long since faded from society's active gossip, replaced by newer scandals and fresher intrigues among the region's aristocratic families. But within the walls of Ashford Hall itself, it remained a quiet, enduring testament to the simple truth Elinor had spent her entire life striving to prove. That genuine worth, patiently demonstrated through honest work and unwavering integrity, could ultimately overcome even the most entrenched barriers of birth and circumstance, no matter how impossible such a victory might once have seemed on that painful afternoon when a duke's harsh dismissal had nearly convinced her otherwise. Years later, when Grace had grown into a capable young woman managing her own portion of the family's expanding trade interests, she asked her mother a question that Elinor had long anticipated, though she had never quite settled on the perfect answer. "Mama, were you ever truly afraid, back when it all began? Afraid that Uncle Alastair's rejection meant the end of everything you hoped for?" Elinor considered the question carefully, remembering the young woman she had once been, standing in that grand library with her carefully prepared papers clutched to her chest, absorbing words that had felt, in that moment, like a permanent verdict on her worth. "I was terrified," she admitted honestly. "I believed for a time that his judgment reflected some fundamental truth about my place in the world, that ambition and intelligence meant nothing against the weight of birth and title. It took me a long while to understand that his rejection said far more about his own limitations than it ever said about my actual worth." "And Uncle Julian saw that worth immediately," Grace said, a note of quiet admiration in her voice for the uncle who had become something of a legend within family lore. "He did," Elinor confirmed. "Though I think, in truth, it was not simply that he saw something Alastair could not. It was that he was willing to look past the surface of things entirely, past titles and expectations and society's rigid rules, to actually see the person standing before him. That willingness, Grace, is rarer and more valuable than any title or fortune a person might inherit." Grace nodded slowly, absorbing her mother's words with the same thoughtful seriousness that had characterized her since childhood. "Do you think Uncle Alastair ever truly forgave himself for what he said that day?" Elinor thought of Alastair, now gray at the temples but still sharp-minded and increasingly gentle in his later years, still unmarried but content in ways he had not been during those early difficult years, having finally reconciled with the woman he had once been forbidden to love, their quiet companionship a source of genuine happiness that had bloomed unexpectedly in the autumn of both their lives. "I believe he did," Elinor said finally. "Not immediately, and not without considerable effort on his part. But watching him these past years, watching the man he has become, I believe his greatest gift to himself was learning to admit when he had been wrong, and choosing to grow from that admission rather than clinging stubbornly to his earlier pride." "That seems a rare kind of courage," Grace observed. "It is," Elinor agreed. "Rarer, perhaps, than the courage it took me to propose that venture in the first place, or the courage your father showed in pursuing me despite every obstacle society placed before us. The courage to admit one's own mistakes, openly and honestly, and to change because of them, that may be the rarest courage of all." Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching the late afternoon light stream through the same library windows that had witnessed so much of her parents' early history together. "I hope I inherit that kind of courage, Mama, whatever obstacles I may face in my own life." Elinor reached out and took her daughter's hand, feeling the weight of everything she had built, everything she had overcome, settling into something that felt very much like peace. "You already have, my darling. I have watched you demonstrate it countless times already, in ways both large and small. Trust yourself, Grace, exactly as your father once trusted me, and exactly as I eventually learned to trust myself. That trust, more than any title or fortune, will carry you through whatever challenges lie ahead. Outside, the estate's gardens continued their eternal cycle of bloom and quiet rest, the same gardens that had witnessed Elinar's darkest humiliation and her greatest joy, standing now as simply another chapter in a much longer story, one that had begun with a duke's harsh rejection and grown, through patience, courage, and genuine love, into a legacy far more enduring than any single moment of doubt or dismissal could have ever predicted. The venture Elinar had first proposed with trembling hands in Alastair's library continued to flourish for generations, its success no longer remarkable in itself, but rather simply the foundation upon which an entire family's continued prosperity was built. And though society had long since moved on to newer stories and fresher scandals, within the quiet halls of Ashford Hall, the story remained, told and retold through the years, not as a tale of scandal or unlikely romance, but as a simple, enduring reminder that worth is never determined by birth alone, and that the most unexpected rejections sometimes carry within them the seeds of an entirely different and far more beautiful beginning than anyone could have possibly imagined.